We want to get to breaking news now out of Memphis. A jury has found 3 former police officers charged in the deadly beating of Tyre Nichols not guilty on all 7 state counts. The officers' charges included second-degree murder, aggravated assault, and aggravated kidnapping. Last year, the 3 were among a total of 5 convicted on federal charges, including witness tampering. Police camera footage captured officers kicking and punching Nichols after he fled a January 2023 traffic stop. He died 3 days after the beating. CBS News correspondent Omar Villafranca has been following this case every step of the way. And Omar, remember that video when it came out, just so tremendously disturbing and upsetting. Take us through this decision.
Well, of course, the judge came forward and the court said that the verdict had been reached. So everybody came on in and they filed in. The judge told everyone not to, no outbursts in the court, which is pretty typical in emotional cases like this. And as you mentioned, Tadarius Bean, Demetrius Haley, Justin Smith, all found not guilty. They each faced 7 charges, the big one being second-degree murder. That was punishable by up to 15 to 25 years in prison. Official oppression, aggravated assault, aggravated kidnapping, all those charges that you mentioned, all not guilty. A little background here on this jury, though. This happened in Memphis, Shelby County, near the Arkansas border. That's where Memphis is. Well, during the course of this trial, they were saying we needed to find an impartial jury, so they had to go 300-plus miles to Chattanooga area, Hamilton County, to find that jury. So the jury is not from Memphis. They are from Hamilton County, 300-plus miles away. We found out it is an all-white jury. There were no African Americans on that jury. The jury in Memphis is a predominantly African-American town. So that's something that now people are talking about. A little bit more of some perspective here. There was a federal trial before this, and those officers either pled guilty or were found guilty of charges, but they were lesser charges, everything from excessive force with injury and witness tampering. They have not been sentenced for the federal crimes that they were convicted of, so we're going to wait to see. But the families are looking for justice, and now they're not going to get it from the state side. They feel they're going to have to get it from the federal, but we have to see with those lesser charges what kind of sentence comes from that. Any reaction that you're tracking so far? It's very early. Some of the family is in there. They were quiet. They weren't allowed, obviously, no outbursts of any sort. But we're waiting to see if they come out and speak. Interesting note that we do have some reporting from Elise Preston also told us that the prosecution brought 5 witnesses forward. The defense brought 17 witnesses. And keep in mind, the burden of proof is on the prosecution to prove their case. That's what they used, 5 witnesses. The defense used 17 witnesses, and maybe that weighed in on the jury. They polled the jury. It was unanimous on their decision-making, but unless the jurors want to talk to find out what exactly convinced them, we may never know. This is a shot inside the courthouse right now that we are watching. There were 2 other officers who did not stand in this trial. Where do they fall in the case? Mm-hmm. Well, some of them were involved in the federal trial, and some of them also testified in cases too, talking about their action. Now, the defense basically, part of their argument was that everything that they were doing was part of their training. They were saying the whole time that Tyre Nichols, when you saw the video of the beating, they said they kept on asking him to comply. They kept on asking him to comply, give him his hands so they could put him in cuffs. And the defense kept on saying once the cuffs were on, the beating stopped. Now, there was arguments of prosecution saying this was excessive force, this is what caused it, and that nobody was stopping anybody else from hitting him. And the prosecution was relying on that, hoping that the jury would see that as enough to reach that bar for second-degree murder. But as we learned just a few minutes ago, it was not. They were not guilty on all charges. What happens next in this case? What are you tracking? Well, there's going to be civil, first of all. And granted, there's no jail time for a civil case. This could challenge, obviously, the way Memphis PD operates. And that's no solace. That's not going to bring back Nichols for their family. But we want to see what kind of punishment is going to be handed down on the federal case, which already happened. But again, those officers were convicted on lesser charges. There was no murder charge. Like I said, the charges were excessive force with injury and witness tampering on the federal level, not the second-degree murder that would have gotten 15 to 25 on the state level. Okay.
Omar Villafranca, thank you. Let's bring in CBS News legal contributor Rebecca Roiphe now. What is your reaction to this verdict?
I think it's extremely significant, especially given the fact that this administration, this federal administration, has indicated that it is less interested in pursuing police reform than previous administrations and is backing off those kinds of efforts. So we're going to see fewer of the kinds of cases that settled earlier for these police officers, and more will rest on what states do and what state juries do. And so I think a lot of people are paying attention to this, and it is a significant case because it is not sending the messages that the families of the victim would have wanted here and other activists would have wanted, instead sending a very different message.
Right, he was pulled over, and then later the Memphis police chief found that there was no real reason to pull him over. He had fled the traffic stop, run toward his mother's house, was screaming for her while this was happening. I want to see if you can pick up on what Omar was talking about in terms of the difference between the state and federal charges and the severity, the state charges being second-degree murder, aggravated assault, aggravated kidnapping, amongst other state charges. Omar saying that the second-degree murder could have called for 15 to 20 years in prison versus the federal charges that they were found guilty of, which was witness tampering and excessive force.
Right, exactly. I mean, there were federal charges of civil rights violations resulting in death or injury, but those are not the charges that they pled guilty to. So these other charges are going to result in, much less significant sentences, especially given the fact that they were pleas. And so, again, I mean, of course it's significant. Any amount of jail time is significant, and that does send a message. But I think the message is muted in large part by this verdict, which, is loud and clear, given the fact that they didn't find even any of these lesser charges that the police officers were guilty. And so as a result, yes, there will be some consequences and some accountability. And that's important. As Omar was saying, it's really important that we look at this not just from a criminal justice perspective, but from the perspective of police reform. And that may indeed happen within Memphis and within other cities. But, to the extent that you're looking for some, big deterrent and big, moment of accountability and a moment in which we really think about what our relationship to police are and police brutality, this is not that moment.
Let's go ahead and listen to some of the live remarks that we're capturing outside the courthouse.
Those who are sworn to uphold it.
What do you think what just didn't connect? What do you think it was? Was it the training? Was it the character witnesses? What do you think it was?
It's so hard to figure that out. It could be any number of a million things, and I am disinclined to try to say, oh, we should have done this differently or we should have done that differently, because I think the trial team did an excellent job. Obviously you had a situation where, arguably two of the more culpable defendants were not present. Then that allowed the remaining defendants to point the finger at others. I personally think that when you take a look at all of the evidence, that shouldn't matter. Perhaps the jury took a different view. It's just impossible to say.
I know it's very early, but is this a case that you all are looking to retry?
I think it is too early for us to say that. I don't know what the grounds would be for that. We do have to accept the finality of a jury verdict in most cases.
Any thoughts about the jury being from Chattanooga and an all-white jury?
Obviously, people have mentioned that as an issue. I'm not going to speculate about that. I think it's a testimony to the fairness of our criminal justice system that we bent over backwards to get a jury from another jurisdiction to assure that the defendants were given a fair trial. Beyond that, I don't think I should comment.
The defense worked on pointing at Emmett Martin as the most violent of everyone there. It seems that the man have landed with the jury. You're securing a guilty plea for Emmett Martin. Can you talk a little more about his involvement?
Well, obviously, I think the proof speaks for itself, and Mr. Martin was, extremely involved and culpable, and played a key role in the unjustified death of Tyre Nichols. What's going to happen over at the federal court and what will happen with his case remains to be seen.
What kind of conversation did you have with Tyre Nichols' family when they left today?
We spoke to them briefly. Obviously, they were devastated. I think you could imagine that they would be devastated. I think they were outraged, and I think we can understand why they'd be outraged by this result, given the evidence. They quite understandably decided that they needed to go home and process all this, and we're going to give them that respect and respect their privacy.
What sort of message does this give to specifically the Memphis Police Department, who just got done with this pattern and practice investigation and really doesn't have to grapple with the consequences of that either?
Right. So it's important to note that, there have been guilty verdicts over on the federal side. I'm not going to speculate about what will happen over on the federal side, but it's not like there have been no consequences whatsoever from the tragic killing of Tyre Nichols. I personally think that if we're going to make any sense of this tragedy, if we're going to have any silver lining from this dark cloud of both the event itself and, in my view, today's verdict, it has to be that we need to reaffirm our commitment to police reform and to doing what we need to do to make sure that tragedies like this don't happen again. And I remain committed to that. I'm sure the city of Memphis remains committed to that, and we're not giving up on that.
Are you surprised that they didn't, because they could have gone for lesser charges than second-degree murder? What, 9 different charges they could have gotten, and they didn't even have to go to those. Did that surprise you?
Was I surprised that there wasn't a single guilty verdict on any of the counts or any of the lesser included offenses, given the overwhelming evidence that I think that we presented? Yes, I was surprised. Do I have an explanation for it? No.
How much did the state rely on the videos from that night, the Skycop video, the body cam videos? How much did you all rely on that as far as this trial goes?
Well, I mean, you saw the evidence. You saw the trial as well as I. I think it speaks for itself. Certainly the videos were a big part of the state's case, as they understandably would be. But I don't think the trial team relied entirely on the videos. I think they brought to bear witness testimony, very effective cross-examination of the defense witnesses, and some compelling opening and closing arguments. And I think when you add it all together, I think the state did a hell of a job. I'm not Monday morning quarterbacking about any of the decisions the trial team made. I think they did an excellent job. They're a credit to our office. Anybody who does any kind of jury trial work knows that you just can't predict what a jury will do. Them's the breaks, and it's a bitter pill to swallow, particularly in a case like this. But like I said, we can strongly disagree with the jury's verdict, but we nonetheless respect the jury.
Do you have any messages for people in the community who have had direct confrontations with not only the Scorpion team, but other police officers? There are federal lawsuits that are currently underway, people who have accused the Memphis Police Department of brutality. Do you have any message to them?
I guess my message to the community would be twofold. A, even if you were out there outraged by this verdict, please respond in a lawful, peaceful manner. Second, as I said earlier, with respect to any charge of violation of the law, including by those who are sworn to uphold it, we'll enforce the law. And just as we did aggressively in this case, we'll do that in any other case in which the facts and the law suggest that anybody in the law enforcement community or anybody else has violated the law and used excessive force.
Does Mr. Hagerman or Headley or Johnson have any comment?
Yeah, please.
Y'all tried the case.
Hager?
We tried real hard. We fought real hard in there. We knew this was always going to be difficult. As D.A. Mulroy said, we're trying the 3 least culpable in terms of, obviously, Mr. Martin was the primary actor, and he's entered a guilty plea. Mr. Mills, with the baton strikes, again, a primary actor, and he's entered a guilty plea. So we knew this trial would be hard. I think y'all saw us fight in there. We did the best we could, and the family, they've been great through this. Today's heartbreaking to them, but they've been with us fighting.
What is it like for you all to go through all of this and looking at the video and talking with the family and definitely expecting something else?
It's disappointing. It's heartbreaking. You try cases. It's a business of trying cases, though. Okay? There's always risk and there's reward, but we keep on going. We try to get justice. And I think we tried hard in there this week to get justice. I know the family was behind us, and we didn't get the result we wanted or they wanted, but they've thought about Tyre obviously a lot this week, and they're thinking about Tyre now, and
Dylan?
it's been hard.
Tanisha? Nathan?
Was there any bit of evidence that was presented over the last week and a half, or any argument made by the defense that felt particularly salient to you guys, that you kind of were like, this kind of sucks to deal with and try and like move around?
I don't think we can at this point sort of, like I said, Monday morning quarterback or think retroactively about this or that. This blow was particularly powerful, that one was particularly powerful. I think structurally, as Mr. Hagman's already mentioned, the two defendants who were most culpable weren't present in the courtroom, right? That doesn't mean that the remaining three defendants weren't culpable. You heard our arguments in there about criminal responsibility, people being responsible for the acts of another, the duty to intervene, the duty to take affirmative steps at what was clearly, a person being beaten to death. That was a structural part of the trial that was a challenge for the trial team. Other than that, I think it's hard to identify any one thing, and it's hard to get inside the mind of the jury.
Well, this verdict, is this going to affect Emmett Martin's plea deal at all, or any sentence he may receive when he does plead guilty?
That's up to the federal court. We really can't speculate on
What
that.
about on the state level?
Well, I think we're not really prepared to talk about that just yet, because what we're doing is we're waiting to see what happens over with the federal sentencing. And once we see what happens with the federal sentencing, we'll have a better idea of what we want to do with that case.
And my last question about the jury, because obviously the jury made the decision, but those who don't understand the process, I know you all want an unbiased jury, but why Chattanooga? Where did that come from as far as that jurisdiction?
Do you happen to know? Yeah.
Yeah, there was a motion filed defense to change venue, and there was a study done of the amount of publicity in the various large cities in Tennessee, and it was found that Chattanooga had the lowest amount of pretrial publicity with regard to this case, and so that's why it was chosen.
All right. Thank you all very much.
All right.
We were just listening to members of the prosecuting team reacting to the not guilty verdict to state charges against three of the officers involved in the beating death of Tyre Nichols. And we were hearing from District Attorney for Shelby County, Stephen Mulroy, as well as some of the prosecutors who led the trial team. I want to bring in CBS News correspondent Omar Villafranca back because, Omar, we heard quite a bit from DA Mulroy there about whether they're going to retry the case. He said, he doesn't know on what grounds they would do that for. He mentioned he had spoken with the Nichols family. They are outraged and devastated. He mentioned commitment to police reform in Memphis and that he was surprised by the verdict and at this point didn't have an explanation as to why it went that way.
Well, and he also mentioned, talking about that Bean, Haley, and Smith, he kind of framed them as not the main culprits. The main culprits being Desmond Mills and Emmett Martin, who pled guilty to charges. They were not on trial, basically calling them, these three former officers, kind of lesser actors, but still involved. So what happens next, we're going to have to wait and see. In these civil trials, I've covered enough of these, that in these civil trials, sometimes you can get a different verdict. And mind you, this is something where there's damages that can be awarded from the city may having to pay the family and the county having to pay the family. And sometimes that's the only way that sometimes police departments are forced to change their mode of operating. And I've covered cases like this in Texas and in South Carolina. So it makes police departments look at themselves. So while the jail time, they're going to have to wait for the punishment on the federal charges, which were lesser, whether that leads to reform on the state level or the city level, the impetus may be the civil trial.
And I want to ask you about Martin and Mills, the two officers who prosecuting team do point to as being the most culpable, those who pled guilty to the state charges. Did I hear the DA correctly and that they are going to wait for the sentencing from the federal charges to ascertain what they're going to ask for in terms of sentencing, again, for these two officers not involved in this state trial case who were just found not guilty?
I believe you're correct, because mind you, there was plea deals on the federal level, but the punishments have not come down on the federal level just yet. They were waiting to see what happens on the state level. And the reason why, also probably to see what was happening here, but the lawyers also kind of don't want to step on each other's toes on the federal level and the state level, and then give a jury a chance on the state level, to weigh their judgment. They obviously did. And again, pointing to Mills and Martin being the bigger culprits in this. Martin was the one with the baton. If you've happened to see the video, it's pretty brutal. You see the baton hits, and Mills obviously being involved with punching and the strikes. So there's going to be a lot of eyes also on the punishment for them for the federal level. And then again, I know I go back to this, but that civil trial, while it will not enact any jail time, that is the lesson, the pocketbook lesson that Shelby County and Memphis may have to deal with, which could lead to reforms.
Omar, hang out with us if you can. I want to bring Rebecca Roiphe back. Rebecca, a couple things that the DA mentioned and that Omar and I have been discussing that I want to ask of you. First off, when it comes to the two that were most culpable, according to DA Mulroy, Martin and Mills, whom they have guilty pleas from, they said it doesn't mean the remaining three don't bear some responsibility. And then they talked about the duty to intervene. Can you go into that for us?
Sure, absolutely. So, first of all, we're looking at criminal laws here, and that, the burden of proof is on the government to show that these were offenses that have very specific elements that were committed beyond a reasonable doubt. And so, there are so it depends exactly on what law you're talking about, whether or not there's a duty to intervene and and to what extent that exists. And I think that's very important in the world of police reform, because that's where we see, room to push police officers, whether or not, there's a criminal verdict of guilty or not, but to behave in a way that we think as a community, our police officers should. And so that's built into the criminal law. And the fact that the jury did not find that there was a duty here does not mean that in other contexts there aren't duties, and that they don't matter, especially in the civil context. As Omar was saying, those cases will also help highlight what that duty is and in what context it pertains in these particular cases.
One of the prosecutors was also asked about the venue. Omar had been telling us that there had been a request for a venue change, for it not to be in Memphis. This took place in Chattanooga before an all-white jury. The trial attorney was asked why Chattanooga, how did that come about? And he said that there was a survey and they found that that was the area that had the lowest amount of pretrial publicity. What does that mean?
So when you're looking for a change in venue, the assumption is, if you're going to change the venue, that the jurors in a particular area have been exposed to just too much media and too much publicity on a particular subject to be fair and unbiased. And so if there's a determination that a change of venue is appropriate, what it essentially means is that you want to look for a venue where that is not the case. And so what the prosecutor was saying was that this was the closest venue that they could find where their surveys showed that the public had not been so tainted by particular knowledge or preconceptions of what happened in this case that they could sit on this jury and judge impartially.
When might we expect sentencing on the federal charges, the lesser charges for these three officers?
I would imagine that would come, things go at different paces. So it's not, it's not clear, but it should be, now that they've had this was one of the holdups. Obviously, they were waiting for this to happen. So I imagine they get themselves together in the next couple of months. We should see some kind of consequences in the federal case.
Is there anything that you want to touch on in terms of the civil aspect that Omar was talking about?
Well, I just want to say, I thought that there was, a couple of things that were said at that press conference were really important to highlight. And that is that, the fact that there was not a conviction here does not mean that something terribly wrong did not happen, and that there wasn't a tragedy, and that this tragedy could not have been averted. And I think it's important to look to those civil cases because they can push the police department in that direction, but so can the public. And I think it's extremely important to not end our interest in these questions with criminal cases, because criminal cases are just so idiosyncratic because of juries. And they're also, very specific in terms of what has to be proven and in what way and with what burden of proof. And so that does not mean that there will not be accountability. There isn't accountability. And even aside from accountability, the more important thing is, or at least as important, is that this be prevented from ever happening again. There are certainly things that could have been averted, whether or not there's criminal liability.
Okay, Rebecca, let's go back to Omar. Omar, I believe I misspoke when I said the jury all white. There's an important distinction here. Can you talk to us about that?
Well, yeah, part of the jury, what I wanted to say is the jury pool was from Hamilton County, was from Chattanooga. They weren't from Memphis in Shelby County. So the jury pool, from what the trial, everything was Memphis-based. Now, we've had reporters, and the DA you heard was asked about the jury. There was no African Americans on that jury. And now, granted, we want to see the boxes that if you've ever been called for jury, you check a box, for race and whatnot. And you can tell, but you don't know how people look. I don't have eyes on the jury, and the TV and the cameras can't show the jury. So that's something that we want to clarify. But the DA was asked, was it an all-white jury? It was an all-white jury going on, and we feel comfortable saying yes about that right now. But the fact that the jury was from 300 plus miles away from Memphis, I'm not sure how much the viewers are familiar with the demographics of Tennessee, and Memphis is over here on the border with Arkansas. You have to go all the way across the state, 300 plus miles, to find a jury. Completely different makeup of people. Memphis being a predominantly African-American city, Chattanooga and Hamilton County not being predominantly African-American. So did that play a role? We'll have to see. Now, they did poll the jury before they read the verdicts, and they basically had to say, was this unanimous? And they kind of do that to make sure that everything is, I's are dotted and T's are crossed. And it was unanimous. But until somebody's able to speak to the jury and hear, maybe what swayed them in that room, it's kind of hard to tell. You heard the DA Mulroy say, you never know what a jury is going to decide, how they're interpreting evidence. We're not even sure, if there was questions. Usually if there's a jury question, it'll come out to the judge and go back and forth. But that wasn't asked during the course. Did you have any questions or clarifications? So we didn't hear about that. Obviously, the family being very disappointed in the state case. They're going to have to look to see what happens on the federal level when it comes to the sentencing and the civil trial. Mistakes, if there was mistakes made during the state and the federal, the civil trial being the last one kind of has the last chance to look at and say, okay, don't make this mistake again. Let's see if we can get it right on this time. And maybe if that happens, that's where there's possible reform, and that's what the DA has been saying there.
Rebecca, final thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a different burden of proof, which is much lesser in the civil cases. And it's important to watch what happens in those cases. It's less obviously splashy. And there's I think it's less satisfying for victims and some of the advocates for the victims. But I think, you can see consequences there that are important and really, change going forward.
Rebecca, Roiphe, and Omar Villafranca, thank you for joining us on this breaking news.